Nintendo has been around as a major player in the game industry for an incredibly long time in terms of how long video games have been mainstream. Because of that, they're naturally going to have a massive library of games amassed over the past several decades. How they've handled this library of classic games, though, has definitely undergone some changes over the years, and nowadays we're seeing things like 3D All-Stars or Skyward Sword HD. Maybe this is the kind of thing we should expect for the foreseeable future. In today's video essay, we'll be discussing the past decade of Nintendo's handle on their classic games, and what I like to call Nintendo's classic game conundrum. It was seemingly around the Wii to early 3DS days that Nintendo began to realize, oh man, we can still make money off these classic games, and started releasing old titles on their eShop or whatever the equivalent digital store on the Wii was that nobody remembers anymore. Eventually, digital classic games would come to be known as the Virtual Console, and would be brought to the Wii U later as well. There were definitely some interesting things made available, such as classic Gen 1 and 2 Pokémon games on the 3DS with the ability to transfer to modern games. The system was definitely far from perfect. Like, why were Nintendo DS games available to purchase on the Wii U but not 3DS? Did Nintendo forget the 3DS is back compatible and can run DS games just fine? But for the most part, there was something going on here, and some steps in a pretty interesting direction. Consumers had access to this vast library made over the span of decades, while the company printed money off of games they hadn't sold in stores for years, and they could continue to pump out digitally with little effort to make them emulatable. When the Switch initially released, it was lacking a lot of features. For example, people were hyped for the eventual release of an internet browser to have this console double as a tablet of sorts, but now over 4 years later, Nintendo still hasn't bothered to put in an internet browser. The commonly accepted excuse for this was so that people can't hack their Switches, but people have been doing that just fine without an internet browser for years, so that probably can't be the real excuse, right? But one of the biggest features people looked forward to after the release of the Switch, and the main topic of this video, was the Virtual Console. We had in our hands a home console handheld hybrid. Imagine the possibilities with a vast library of classic games you can play on the go, and then when you get home you can pop it in the dock and keep playing on your TV. For about a year, people were in hot anticipation, when are we going to see the Virtual Console release? But eventually we got our answer of what was to happen. Nintendo Switch Online. More games, more features, more fun. It seemed like Nintendo was going to start charging for their online service that barely works. I sometimes commentate online Smash tournaments. I know how sketchy Nintendo's online service can be. But hey, maybe there were some other benefits that made it worth it past just paying to be able to play online. There's a cloud service that lets you back up your saves, which I guess if you're not willing to shell out, you just can't back up your saves, that's cool. The subscription includes special offers, which are literally just other things they try to sell you. But one of the big things made available is access to a library of classic NES and SNES games. That's pretty much as far as classic games go on the Switch. The Switch had a lot of potential as a classic game console, as a home console and handheld hybrid. There's many people out there who pick up a Switch purely as a great format to play indie games. I'm sure there would be a large Switch audience for classic games as well if it was an actual option. The Switch could have played home console games up to the GameCube, maybe even Wii for several games if the Joy-Cons were used like Wii Remote and Nunchuck, and played handheld games up until the Nintendo DS. Just have the two Nintendo DS screens side by side in a way. As well, these classic 3D games could have also been run in HD, the same way emulators such as Dolphin already do, and the way games such as Mario 3D All-Stars and Skyward Sword already are. But rather than making a vast classic game library available in a way that allows people to play how and where they want, as the slogan of the Switch is seemingly supposed to be, Nintendo decided they'd use their classic games to make money in a much different way. Instead, they decided their library of NES and SNES games would instead be used as an incentive for their online service to add value to the barely functional online, and the rest of their classic games outside of those consoles would only be released when they bothered cherry-picking certain titles to release at full price and or with limited access to drive sales through the fear of missing out. Let's deconstruct that whole statement and start with the first point, using a library of NES and SNES games to add value to their online. A lot of people were and still are mad at the online service fee for an online that isn't even the most reliable. But there's a lot of people who figure it's worth it anyway, because look at this other value that's being added through these classic games. It puts an almost halo over the online service, like, look at this stuff they have done though. Nintendo knew that starting to charge for online would result in incredible backlash and criticism at the decision, so they slapped on things like NES and SNES games, a cloud service, special offers, and this halo of more games, more features, more fun, because they knew that by doing this, they could prevent raw backlash by instead dividing people into different camps. You have the camp of those who are like, oh come on, it's just like 20 bucks a year, it costs them to run their servers after all. Besides, look at all these classic games made available to you. Whereas the other vocal camp is like, we've never had to pay for Nintendo Online before, why should we now? There's no real value added to it, and it's just a necessary extra cost of owning a Switch if you actually want to play with others online. And then you have another camp of people who are the player base that just don't understand the situation at all, or don't want to speak about it or whatnot, and just kind of accept that this is the way things are. All while Nintendo just smiles at them continuing to print money from the turmoil they cause by recycling games they've already had for like 20 to 30 years. In terms of those willing to speak out, had Nintendo purely started charging for online with no other incentives, it would be almost completely negative criticism across the board. But because, for very little effort, they took their library of decades-old games to throw in as extra value, all of a sudden, all their outspoken player base finds themselves divided. Is Nintendo Switch Online a good thing? Is it a bad thing? By creating this divide, they don't need to change anything and can just keep charging the way they are. There's far from a majority of their vocal players vying for change, so they therefore don't need to change and can continue doing as they do. So that's how their classic NES and SNES games are used, but what about the rest of their classic games library? You thought you could use the Switch as a classic games console for games from Nintendo 64 to Wii and Game Boy to DS? Not happening. What the heck even is the Virtual Console? These classic games are stuck in the past. No real feasible way you can legally play them unless you own the original game and hardware, and even if you do, you can't play them on modern technology. Aw man, I haven't been able to play these classics I was really into for so long. I really wish I had a chance to pick them up again, or get into a classic title I heard so much about, but never got the chance to get into back then, and now I'll probably never get the chance. Unless... what's that over there? A light at the end of the tunnel? Super Mario 3D All-Stars is a limited release for the next half a year to celebrate Mario's 35th anniversary before we stop selling this game. This is your chance to experience these classic games, but only for a limited time, so you better rush out and pick it up at full price if you don't want to miss out. Remember the first ever Fire Emblem game that never got localized? Which, by the way, I believe is considered one of the worst Fire Emblem games among the Fire Emblem community? We've finally localized it as part of another anniversary event. It's another limited release, so better pick it up as soon as you can. What's that? There's only one main series Zelda game on the Switch so far while we develop the sequel to Breath of the Wild? Well, I mean, technically there's two if you count the Link's Awakening remake, and there's also 2 spin-offs. Worry not, it's Skyward Sword HD, the definitive version of this decade-old Wii game we're re-releasing at full price. It's totally not just scaled up the same way an emulator like Dolphin can already do, and with new custom controls the same way an emulator like Dolphin can already do. Yes, this is absolutely worth full price. There's also a new quality of life change of being able to go to the sky from virtually anywhere. It's just locked behind an amiibo paywall. Here in Canada, full price games are $80, so with an amiibo if you want the full Skyward Sword experience, it'll cost over $100. Want some more classic Pokemon adventures? Well, here's Diamond and Pearl, literally just scaled up rather than putting a new modern twist on a classic title, like literally every other Pokemon remake ever made. Were you expecting us to actually create the world we tried to represent back then, but didn't yet have the technology to actually make it yet? Nope. Here's the exact same thing you've played already. Exact same thing you've played already. Exact same thing you've played already. Exact same thing you probably haven't already played. But why would you want to anyway? Each one of these is gonna cost you the same as any other full price game despite just emulating or scaling up. So what exactly is going on here? Honestly, it's a really smart and scummy business model. Nintendo releases their oldest classic games as an incentive for their online service, so the internet doesn't riot against them and they print money from Switch Online. Meanwhile, the rest of their classic games they clutch close and refuse to share. This creates what I like to call a classic game drought. Fans cannot play these classic games on modern hardware, and can't legally play them at all if they don't own the classic hardware. This drought is also kept up by their frequent takedowns of ROM sites. How dare fans think they can freely play the games we refuse to sell them? This classic game drought creates a classic game thirst in fans, which Nintendo can use to their advantage to look at their list of games they refuse to sell and be like, what do we want to emulate and ship out at full price? What do we want to make a limited release? What other ways can we monetize this? After this drought of classic games, Nintendo swoops in like some great savior. I have just the solution to quench that classic game thirst. All you need to do is give me the cost of a full-priced game. This is your chance. You better not miss it. And somehow, they create this delusion in so many consumers that they've painstakingly crafted definitive remakes of these classic titles. I've had people come into my Skyward Sword streams before asking me, are you excited for the Skyward Sword remake? Like, excuse me, what remake? This is a remake. This is a remaster. This is a scaled up emulation. And so is this. There's this image that these are versions of these games that have been meticulously crafted to be the best versions of these games. I already have a video covering 3D All-Stars, and anybody who's seen that video knows that this is clearly not the case. On launch, Sunshine even had the issue of debug squares appearing in some levels, which wasn't even an issue in the original game, just an issue in emulators like Dolphin. Did they not have playtesters to tell them about these debug squares? Nintendo refuses to sell you these games, doesn't want you emulating them, and the moment they have the audacity to say, okay, I guess we'll sell it to you, but you better rush out and buy it at full price, then they can't even bother to make it better than a typical emulated experience anyway. Nintendo's modern stance on their classic games nowadays is to use their oldest games to get people off their ass about Nintendo Online being a massive ripoff, and refuse to sell their other classic games and take down sites that provide ROMs of the games they refuse to sell, to create this drought of classic games they can then capitalize on by releasing titles they handpick they figure will sell well, and seemingly produce it to whatever the lowest standard they can still sell it at full prices. It's honestly a very smart business strategy, a really smart way to maximize profits by maintaining sales while cutting production costs. It's smart, but it's also pretty scummy. So, how would I change things? I know I talked about this in the 3D All-Stars video essay, but most viewers of my essays are viewing their first video of my channel, so it's worth going through again. First off, I would bring features to the Switch that should have been available ages ago, an internet browser and the virtual console. Players would be able to play NES to Wii games. The Wii U is a tricky situation since it had the two screens, so the Switch can't exactly be as easily back compatible as generations past. But I mean, nowadays the only really standout Wii U game that hasn't been ported to the Switch already is Xenoblade Chronicles X. As for handheld, Game Boy to Nintendo DS games would be available. The DS may need its screens to be side by side, and games that depend on the touchscreen might have to be either handheld only, or rely on the Switch controller's smart motion. Honestly, 3DS games could probably be handled as well, but would be a bit trickier for managing the two screens, considering the top screen is a bit wider, and people would probably be ticked the Switch doesn't have a 3DS card slot. But the really big thing I would do, mobile emulation and cloud saves. Most modern smartphones can already easily handle all the way up to the Nintendo DS. Imagine it, a mobile Nintendo eShop where one can purchase classic Nintendo games to add to their library and play on the go, from NES to N64 and Game Boy to Nintendo DS. Purchases would be synced across one's Nintendo account. Let's say you pick up Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky on your Switch. You'd then be able to play it in your library on your phone when you're on the go, backing up your saves across devices on the cloud. If they're still going to charge for online, have it, for one, be much cheaper, like $5 to $10 annually. Include Pokémon Home as part of the service bundled in with online. Have cloud saves for the virtual console across devices, and allow Pokémon from classic Pokémon games to be transferred to Home to be easily transferred to modern games or traded with friends. Remember how crazy Pokémon Go was at launch? Imagine if a library of classic Pokemon games was available on mobile devices, or even just the Switch itself. How fast that would take off. I know countless people who played Pokemon in the past, but now haven't touched it for years, but if they heard they could download classic games they loved in the past right onto their phones, they'd be all over that, just like countless people were with Pokemon Go who hadn't played the IP in years but picked that up. I know this whole idea probably isn't possible in this form for one key reason. The whole issue of Apple having a monopoly on their devices through the app and iTunes Store, Google having a monopoly on their devices through the Google Play Store. Heck, even Nintendo's essentially got a monopoly on their own consoles with the eShop. Plenty of others have covered this topic more in depth already, and I'd recommend looking into that whole debacle if you're not already familiar with it. But I will say that maybe both the app and gaming space will be better off without companies holding exclusive rights to selling software on their devices, and are therefore able to charge whatever cut they want from anybody else who wants to sell software. Maybe we'd be able to get more competitive prices in an environment where upstarts have a better chance of getting their footing. Regardless, assuming this issue won't change, that still wouldn't mean it's not possible to purchase games on the Switch, PC, or even mobile through browser, and have them sync with the library for a collection of classic games synced across devices. I'm genuinely surprised that this is something Nintendo hasn't done yet. Imagine what it'd do to their revenue and stock. It seems like it'd be a no-brainer, wouldn't it? But instead of allowing players to play how and where they want, Nintendo would rather create a drought of classic games while using their oldest games to add value to their online service to get away with charging more for it, and cherry-picking their other games when they feel like making a quick buck by swooping in as some savior like they're doing their players some great service by doing this. By cherry-picking games like this, they swoop in like some hero here to solve the problem that they themselves are creating in their player base, this thirst for classic games. They are indeed doing their players a service in a way, just because they refuse to make these games available in any other way. The Switch is a really cool console that has so much potential. It's a very convenient console to play games, whether you have it to play AAA games or even as a handheld indie console. However, one thing the Switch will seemingly never be is a classic games console, as it seems like rather than taking the time to deck out a service people could really get behind, Nintendo would rather maximize their profits for as little effort as possible. With the way the Switch is going, I highly doubt we'll see a turnaround to Nintendo's classic game Conundrum, as much as I'd like to be proven wrong. But I do genuinely hope that at some point in the future, rather than manipulating and dividing their player base, the day will come that Nintendo allows players to once again play how and where they want. Thanks for watching the video.
I look, a flower. I'm about to die, but it's okay because there's a flower here. Yoink. Okay. Okay, then. No, don't you dare. Don't do it. I need bombs. I think, maybe. No, I actually don't need bombs.